After a couple of decades of postmodern irony, eclecticism and detachment, cultural philosophers say we are in urgent need of a new framework to make sense of society and the art it produces. The buzzword that even made it to the vocabulary of Hollywood actor and performance artist Shia LaBeouf is Metamodernism. Joining me is one of the founding fathers of this concept and author of the book Metamodernism. Please welcome Robin van Akker.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. First of all, I think I need to emphasize that I'm not the sole author of the book. I edited it with my colleagues Alison Gibbons and Timotheus Vermeulen. And it is sort of a spin-off of a research blog that I have been editing for the past 8 years, where dozens and dozens of young authors, critics, and theorists have been working on. So this is very much a collaborative project.
Okay. So much for sharing the spotlight. About this collective, why did you guys? What was it that you guys thought that the theories we learned in university, the books we read, they do not longer apply? We can no longer use them to understand society we live in and the art that comes from it.
Well, around 2008-9, so let's say around the financial crisis, we, Tim and I in this case, increasingly had the feeling that the works of theory that we were reading, first as students and then as starting PhD researchers, were not describing anymore the phenomena, the cultural phenomena that we were seeing around us, but neither the sort of the structural conditions over time and age. So it was born from this intuition and then a terrible dose of hubris, of course. And you know what Aristotle said about hubris?
We all know, but please help us.
It's something for the young and the drunk, and that's basically what it was.
Okay, so Metamodernism was born in the pub.
Absolutely, yeah. It was. It's the original essay, Notes on Metamodernism, was also our first published academic article. And that article was very much born from this intuition and sort of an attempt to map all the sort of dominant trends that we saw emerging in culture. But it was still very flawed, and thankfully, because that sort of invited a lot of other researchers to chip in with their ideas and to refine and expand on that original essay.
We're talking science a little bit, so and science starts with definition. Could you give a short and brief definition of the concept of metamodernism, please?
Yes. First of all, it is a structure of feeling.
A structure of feeling?
Yes.
Meaning?
Meaning that it is a feeling, a sentiment that we sort of share within a certain period, a certain generation, a certain situation. We all have the intuitive understanding that there is a certain sensibility that we see across culture, but it's very hard to grasp that sensibility. And the only way, the method with which you can sort of have access to the structure of feeling is by way of the arts. So in terms of methodology, what we have been doing with our team is to map all the dominant trends in, for instance, film, television, theater, literature, poetry, etc. So first from a very monodisciplinary perspective, and then compare these dominant trends to all the dominant cultural forms that have been around in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
I'm trying to get my head around it, Robin. But what might be best if we gave some examples of what is metamodernism for you and where it reacts to, because you're saying it comes after
postmodernism.
Postmodernism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for us, this structure of feeling is characterized by what we call, and that's both a wink and a homage to Frederick Jameson, the great scholar of postmodernism, as the senses of a band. And to explain that, I have to briefly go back to Jameson's.
Band as in something bending,
curved,
right?
Yeah. Jameson described the structural feeling of the postmodern years as the sense of an end. And he was referring to all those debates in arts and culture about the end of the arts, the end of ideology, the end of politics. But ultimately, maybe the most well-known cipher of this sense of an end is the end of history, right? Fukuyama's great book.
Which basically said we live in a capitalist, neoliberalist democracy, and this is about the best way to live. And nothing is going to beat this, right?
Exactly. And most big questions are asked and answered for. Yes. Well, since the 2000s, you've seen a lot of theorists across the political spectrum, so that's from the left to the right, that are talking about the return of history, or the revenge of history, or the kickstarting of history. So that sort of points towards this feeling, this intuition, that you then need to sort of theorize, but this intuition that history is not at all ending, it maybe has ended for a while, but is kickstarted.
Let me ask you for some examples. You brought some.
Yeah.
Should we start with, I have a list right here, the first contrast, you say we can best show this by a contrast,
yes,
is between Happiness, a film by Todd Solondz from '98, and The Royal Tenenbaums.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're mapping these dominant artistic and cultural forms, you sort of assume that they are responding to this structural feeling, right? In the book that we now published, James McDowell, a film scholar, mapped a dominant tendency in film, which is quirky films, right? And quirky films has been so amazingly dominant that the list is just endless of films. But maybe the most typical filmmaker is Wes Anderson for that, right? James writes somewhere that he's the archetypical quirky cineast. Mm-hmm. He contradistinguishes that to the film Happiness, and that is interesting because Happiness is part of a trend of the 90s, basically, of smart films. Those are films that display sort of knowing irony in their cinematography, and a terribly cynic worldview, and sort of a stylistics that lets you disengage from what you're seeing. It's very disaffected. You do not have any sympathy or whatnot through the sort of the mise en scène and the camera work. And of course, in Happiness, that sort of leads, as Jeff Scans, another film scholar, says, to a retreat in disgust, because you're watching at a child molester, basically, mm-hmm. but you're forced to sort of watch it in a very blank style, so not really judging it. What's happening in the quirky films, and maybe we can watch the opening.
Yeah, shall we?
Yeah,
this is the opening
of
the Royal Tenenbaums. Yeah.
Royal Tenenbaum bought the house on Archer Avenue in the winter of his 35th year. Over the next decade, he and his wife had 3 children, and then they separated.
Are you getting divorced?
At the moment, no. But it doesn't look good.
Do you still love us?
Of course I do.
Do you still love Mom?
Yes, very much, but your mother's asked me to leave, and I must respect her position on the matter.
Was it our fault?
No. Oh, obviously, we made certain sacrifices as a result of having children, but no, Lord, no.
Looking at this, yes. help us find the metamodernist clues here.
According to James McDowell, this is sort of a crash course in quirky aesthetics, right? So, first of all, what is interesting is that there is a generic convention to quirky films, and that is always tied to the to comedy, to the comedic, right? So, but it's not so much laughing at characters as that it forces the viewer to laugh at their various quirks, their pathetic behavior, maybe, but always in a way that endears you to the main characters. In terms of style. It's too bad that you didn't have the whole sort of start where you see the opening sequence with the title, etc. But what it is characterized by is an extreme sort of neatness of the frames, right? You see very geometric sort of shots. The frames are almost empty. You saw the street, for instance. There was nobody walking there. It was just Royal Tenenbaum himself walking there. So this extreme neatness that makes it directly clear that what you're watching is not a realist representation of the world, but an artificial, simplified, purified sort of world. This leads to a certain sensibility of the naive, of purity and simplicity. Also, in the sense of the tropes and the themes you see in quirky cinema, a lot of references to the child, childhood, or adults that are sort of arrested in their development or are suffering or living through childhood traumas. So what this film is doing is also displaying sort of this knowingness of filmmaking, sort of meta-cinematic language it has, because it shows you that you're in an artificial world and that the filmmaker is playing with these conventions. But it doesn't do that to sort of ironically distance the viewer, but sort of to engage the viewer within this simplified world that actually keeps the disorder of the real world out of the frame.
You brought a couple of more examples. One of them is Family Guy versus Community.
Yeah. That is from a chapter on television, and a chapter titled "The Joke That Wasn't Funny Anymore," which is sort of telling for this shift in humor that we've been seeing when it comes to sitcoms, sitcoms of the 80s and the 90s, and sitcoms of today. In Family Guy, you see sort of always this parody on pop cultural references, both in its stylistics and the themes and the jokes, etc. But it always ends up in sort of a mode that can only be very cynical or just that ironic. But in Community, you see the same procedure, namely eclectically quoting all kinds of pop cultural references, playing with conventions of other genres. So you have an episode that is about Ghostbusters, etc. But here, the humor doesn't serve to sort of a cynical commentary on the world, but rather serves to bring this group of friends more together, shows kindness and tenderness and intimacy. So the humor serves a whole different purpose.
Yeah. One of the other is The Office and Parks and Recreation, but maybe it would be nice to go to Seinfeld and Louis. Louis being, well, you might think differently of this guy after the Me Too shit happening, but Seinfeld is the postmodern. Could you contrast these?
Absolutely, and very directly, because
Louis being the hero here for you, right, as a metamodernist, or
no, not at all. Because look, we're analyzing culture. For me, a lot of these things are very problematic.
You're not a preacher of the
no, not at all. We're not
okay.
pushing any agenda. We're trying to analyze it and then situate it, and then most of it is politically very sort of dubious.
Okay.
So no, not at all. No. But what is interesting here, it's quite literally sort of Louis' quite literally take on Seinfeld, right? It's a New York comedian with a show in which he features himself. That is sort of there are moments in which you see him performing live in front of an audience. People from both of their lives sort of pop up in the show, etc. But in Seinfeld, the characters are just utterly unsympathetic. It's completely cynical. There's no way that they will ever going to be seriously engaged with anything or anyone around them in their world, right? And Louis C.K. Is doing away with some of the conventions of this type of comedy. For example, there are no laughing tracks. So you do not hear the artificial laughter, which is already an interesting choice. But there's also a lot of moments that he doesn't use for pure comedy. There are a lot of moments in which he actually decides to not make the joke and actually becomes almost not moralistic. He sort of is it's a balancing act, but he doesn't do that. But at least it's very sincere. So from that moment of laughter and making jokes and making fun and being very in your irony mode, he also has certain moments, as Greer Rustad and Kai Schwind excellently explain, in which he's very, very sincere and engaged with the world around him in his own very flawed way.
And this being something very metamodern, and you didn't see this in postmodern sitcoms or comedy? No,
then it was a way to sort of shield yourself from a world that you knew was ridiculous, that disgusted you, but that you saw no way of engaging with or changing in any meaningful way. And I think that the big change is that, and that is what is sensibility in the larger sense stands for, is that at least there's this yearning to move beyond this detached, ironic, cynical mode. For example, to go back to the Tenenbaums, by simplifying your world and being naive in your sort of mode of how you should deal with that simplified corner of the world that you created for yourself, or here in accepting that the world is a shitty place, but you nonetheless have to apply yourself and do something, however
you
futile.
You brought a clip from Louis where he's hanging out with a friend. I think
it's a good illustration.
He hasn't seen for 20 years, and they've been drinking all night and touring around town in his car, and this guy basically says, well,
I'm going to kill myself.
I'm going to kill myself.
Give me one good reason why not.
Yeah.
Louis, look me in the eye and tell me I have one good reason to live.
No.
See, you got nothing.
No, I'm not playing that. I'm not doing it.
What do you mean?
I mean, man. I got my reasons to live. I worked hard to figure out what they are. I'm not just handing them to you. Okay? You want a reason to live, have a drink of water and get some sleep, wake up in the morning and try again like everybody else does.
I get it. Tough love.
No love. Okay? More like tough, not giving a shit anymore, Eddie. If you want to tap out because your life is shit, you know what? It's not your life. It's life.
Yeah, and so he sort of points to the fact that he just has to pick himself up and fetch his children, bring them to school, etc. And sort of a small level of finding meaning and some significance in your life.
This is something you see all over the spectrum in the arts. As a metamodernist cultural critic, you see people making the most of it.
Yeah, so on the one hand, so it's just but one strand, and there are many more, but a very dominant strand is how to deal with this disposition of being ironic, right? So you see the strategy of being naive and childlike, you see the strategy of being sincere, albeit temporarily, albeit the best as you can in whatever flawed way. You see it by sort of moments of engagement with political causes. You see it in many different ways. It's just but one strand, sort of this post-ironic mode that you see across culture.
And okay, so we're reaching the end. For you as a cultural philosopher, this is obviously very interesting. But what's in it for a simple soul like me?
Well, by mapping culturally dominant phenomena, you're ultimately hitting upon a cultural logic. And for us, that cultural logic is tied up with fourth configuration of capitalism, you could say. So ultimately points to what we can think, what we can say, what we can feel in the light of that band, that's enormous. I always say, hidden around the band, that's also part of the sensibility, is a clusterfuck of world historical proportions. Something is going to happen. And what you see is that people try to sort of find a mode to shake themselves out of postmodern contemplacy and finding ways to engage with that sensibility.
It sounds like a good thing, right? But you just said I'm not the preacher of the metamodernist church.
No, because as a cultural theorist, it's not about morality. It's not about the good or the bad. It's about the good and the bad, and ultimately it's about the problematic. Because what you see through all these examples is that there is this yearning to do something. People do it on a local sort of miniature scale. But what is missing...
Could you give an example of outside arts, outside cinema?
Craft beer, that kind of thing, biological eating, that's all.
Rooftop gardens, everything that's hipster and horrible about...
it's both very good, but it's also very... and bad, but it's also very problematic, because how are you going to scale that, for instance, in the light of the ecological crisis?
And
what is the most important thing?
To pinpoint you, this is the metamodernist thing about it. There is a giant clusterfuck approaching us.
That's the structural feeling, yeah.
Okay, and people are trying to do something about it by greening their rooftop or by making craft beers or...
and in a political sense, you see both on the spectrum on the left and the right of the spectrum, you see actually the same kind of sensibility that people are yearning for political language, but actually we don't have that language at the moment. So what you see is that people on the left, for instance, are returning to social democratic ideals of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, people that have been around since the 70s indeed. You also see that on the right side of the spectrum, where they're now railing against postmodernism and wishing to be back in a moment before 1968. So you see
Thierry Baudet, for example.
Yeah, for instance. So, but you see that as well in the States, in the UK. So what is happening is there is this sort of realization that we need to do something, but the complete and utter lack of a vocabulary and an instrumentarium to actually do what is required in the light of that clusterfuck.
Yeah.
And I think that characterizes the structure of feeling.
What comes after metamodernism? You are coining a term, coining a movement. If you read this book, you sort of see it all over the place, right? In the arts, but also in politics, or in cities like Rotterdam. What comes after metamodernism? We have modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism. What now?
I guess that's for a next generation of young theorists with too much hubris to decide. I don't know.
Okay. Thanks for being here, Robin van Akker.